Vice President.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the Supreme Being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations so that, setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Announcements by the President, by the Vice President.
Honorable Senators, I wish to advise that the President of the Senate, Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, is currently acting as President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. I also at this time crave your indulgence to return to this item on the order of paper later on in the sitting.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives on the supplemental order paper, the Miscellaneous Provisions, Proceeds of Crime, and Central Bank Bill 2019 in the name of the Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance.
Vice President, in accordance with Standing Order 62(1)B, I beg to move that the next stage of the Miscellaneous Provisions, Proceeds of Crime, and Central Bank Bill 2019 be taken later in the proceedings.
Honorable Senators, the question is that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The next stage of the Miscellaneous Provisions, Proceeds of Crime, and Central Bank Bill 2019 will be taken later in the proceedings.
Petitions, papers.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay the following paper as listed on the supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance: the Exchequer and Audit Electronic Funds Transfer Amendment Regulations 2019. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Reports from committees.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to present the following reports as listed on the order paper in my name. The 20th report of the Public Administration and Appropriation Committee, 5th session, 2019-2020, 11th Parliament, on an examination into the approval process for land use in Trinidad and Tobago. And the 21st report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, 5th session, 2019-2020, 11th Parliament on an inquiry into the oversight of state agencies under the purview of the Ministry of Education and funding to private secondary school institutions.
Senator the Honorable Clarence Rambarat.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to present the following report as listed on the supplemental order paper in my name. The interim report of the Joint Select Committee on the Miscellaneous Provisions, Local Government Reform Bill 2019. Thank you.
Senator Dirup Timal.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to present the following report as listed on the supplemental order paper in my name. The 8th report of the Joint Select Committee on Land and Physical Infrastructure on an inquiry into the effectiveness of measures in place to reduce traffic congestion on the nation's roads. Thank you.
Urgent questions? Questions or notice? Questions for oral answer.
Leader of Government Business, acting.
Mr. Vice President, there are 4 questions on notice. The government intends to respond to 3 questions on notice, number 13, number 14, and question number 48 to the Minister of Finance. We're respectfully asking for deferral of question number 15 to the Minister of National Security, a deferral of 2 weeks. Mr. Vice President, thank you.
The deferral that is so granted. Senator Mark, question number 13.
On question number 13 to the Minister of Works and Transport.
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, Bridge B18 Piparo is a wooden bridge with an approximate span of 11.2 meters. This bridge has been included for design and reconstruction under the Ministry Phase 3 of the Bridges Reconstruction Program. Phase 3 of the program consists of 25 bridges divided into 2 components. The first comprised 13 bridges and the second consisting of the remaining 12 bridges. B18 Piparo has been included in the first component. On October 15, 2019, the National Infrastructure Development Company, NIDCO, was given approval to award the contract for the design and construction supervision of a new bridge structure at B18 Piparo Road. Upon completion of designs, a construction contract for the new bridge will be completely tendered out and awarded. It should be noted that the Highways Division has undertaken major rehabilitation work as recent as August 2019 to the deck and superstructure of this bridge as an urgent interim measure until further works can be conducted under the above-mentioned program. I thank you.
Senator Mark, supplemental.
Yes, can I ask the Honorable Minister, when will work formally commence on this particular bridge, given the Phase 3 exercise that you mentioned?
Minister.
Mr. Vice President, as I indicated, NIDCO have given the approval for the award of the design and construction supervision. The bridge is in the design stage. Once that is completed, a tender would go out and an award will be made. In the meanwhile, as I said, the bridge have been rehabilitated and is at this time in use. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, can I also ask the Honorable Minister if he can provide us with the estimated value of this particular bridge?
Minister of Works and Transport.
Mr. Vice President, until the design is completed, it is virtually impossible to have an estimated cost. Once the design is completed, then the technical people will have then an approximate cost, which will then go out for a public tender, and by then we will come up with the appropriate price. But until the design is completed, you can't come up with a approximate price.
Can I ask the Honorable Minister whether he has any knowledge, or can he give us an understanding of when is there a particular time frame you would anticipate, that is the Honorable Minister, for the design work or the design work to be completed?
Minister?
On August 50, 2019, NIDCO was given the approval for the design, construction, supervision contract. Normally, contracts like these take approximately 6 to 8 months for the design. Thank you.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Yeah, question number 14 to the Minister of Planning and Development.
Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, I confirm that the matter has been investigated by the EMA, and the action taken consequent to this investigation is as follows. Just by way of history, Mr. Vice President, the EMA issued a CEC number 4498/2015 to the permit holder for the development of 64.49 acres of land at Coromandel Road, Granville Beach, Cedros. This estate falls within the Granville Beach area. In November 2018, based on inquiries by the EMA, the permit holder indicated that all works on the site had ceased, and the permit holder will inform the EMA of recommencement of works. However, there were media reports of work continuing on the site and certain complaints made by persons who were close to the site. As a result, the EMA conducted investigations between April 2nd and April 15, 2019, and the permit holder was informed of specific non-compliance areas. In particular, one of the allegations being made by the residents was that the development interfered with the aquifers, and based on a response from the Water Resources Agency to the EMA via letter dated October 15, 2019, it was noted, and I quote, "The proposed development overlies an unconfirmed aquifer, the Erin Formation. Recharge occurs by the infiltration of water from the ground surface directly above the aquifer. The 64 acres of concern is estimated to be less than 1% of the recharge area. Consequently, its potential impact on the aquifer is expected to be minimal. This development continues to be monitored by the EMA, Mr. Vice President. I thank you."
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, can I ask the Honourable Minister whether he can share with us the extent of the damage to the forests or the forested areas that this particular permit holder destroyed or at least invaded? Can you tell us what portion of the forested areas were affected?
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, there were, based on the reports from the EMA and what I have before me, there was no report from the EMA on damage to the forest. The key issue surrounds, as I said before, the aquifer and damage to the natural water courses which were said to be present on the site. And during the EMA's site visits, April 2nd to April 15, 2019, no natural water courses were identified on the site on any maps of the region, with the exception of a drainage channel at the eastern end which appeared to contain surface runoff. There were complaints in the media about this and the breach of the aquifer, and it is for that reason the Water Resources Agency was contacted, and as I said before, via letter dated October 15, 2019, the WRA confirmed that the potential impact on the aquifer is expected to be minimal. The permit holder has responded to other issues raised by the EMA, and those have been dealt with. The EMA has received no further complaints on the matter, but continues to monitor the development in accordance with the CEC. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, can you share with us what were the other issues that were raised by the EMA with the permit holder as it relates to this development?
Mr. Vice President, there were 3 issues. One deals with the allegation of the potential for damage to the aquifer. which the WRA said was minimal. The other dealt with allegations that there were natural water courses on the site, which were found based on the site visits and the maps of the area. No natural water course was found on the site. And the third had to do with the drainage channels which were being installed on the site and the potential for flooding in the area. And the EMA was satisfied and received no further complaints regarding the potential for flooding given the proposed drainage channels for the 64-acre site. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Could you also share with us, Honorable Minister, what is the nature of the development of this permit holder on that 64-acre site?
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, it's a development of a 64.49-acre site at Coromandel Road, Granville Beach, Cedras. A CC has been issued, but it is not clear to me, Mr. Vice President, what the proposed development is for, whether it is for residential or whatever purpose, but I can't provide that information.
Senator Mark, any more questions?
Like the Honorable Minister to provide it as soon as he can.
Sure. Okay. Senator Obika.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 48 to the Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. TSCT presented its board-approved 2016 strategic plan to Cabinet on the 28th of July 2016, and subsequently to the Minister of Finance on the 19th of August 2016. The company, in executing its funding plans, wrote to the Minister of Finance on the 19th of September 2016 and received a letter of no objection dated 14th of October 2016 from the Minister of Finance for $2.7 billion in capital expenditure associated with the execution of its strategic plan, which includes US $300 million in secured notes and a TT component of TT $680 million. I am advised by TSTT that it is on schedule for delivering its strategic plan initiatives, and it is in line with its financial obligations. The answer to part 2, the US dollar value of the senior secured notes is US $300 million. Answer to part 3, the notes will be secured by a lien on the assets of the issuer, which is TSTT. Therefore, there is no requirement for a government guarantee on the bonds. And finally, the servicing of this debt does not place any incremental burden on TSCT's foreign exchange requirements. The reason being that TSCT's foreign exchange requirements included the collective US obligations of the bond payments.
Honorable members, at this point in time, permit me to revert to item 3 on the order paper. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from Her Excellency the Acting President, the Honorable Christine Kangaloo. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by Her Excellency Christine Kangaloo, Acting President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, to Mr. Augustus Thomas. Whereas the President of the Senate has temporarily vacated her office of Senator to act as President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Christine Kangaloo, Acting President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Augustus Thomas, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 7th of December 2019 and continuing during the acting appointment of Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo as President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, this 5th day of December 2019. Honorable Senators, Senators are required to take the oath.
I, Augustus Thomas, having been appointed a member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibility to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, having regard to the interim report of the Joint Select Committee on the Miscellaneous Provisions Local Government Reform Bill 2019, I beg to move that the committee be granted an extension to March 31st, 2020 to complete its work and to submit a final report. I thank you.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the interim report of the Joint Select Committee on the Miscellaneous Provisions Local Government Reform Bill 2019 be granted an extension to March 31st, 2020 to complete its work and submit a final report. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
Public business, government business, bills, second reading.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I beg to move that a bill entitled "An Act to Amend the Proceeds of Crime Act, Chapter 1127, and the Central Bank Act, Chapter 7902, be now read a second time." Mr. Deputy Speaker, the bill before the House. Vice President, my apologies. I was up late last night talking to the Deputy Speaker. The bill before the House, Mr. Vice President, has 4 clauses. The first clause is simple. It is the title. The second clause seeks to vary the Central Bank Act, specifically Section 27 of the Central Bank Act. And in that Section 27, as it now stands, the Central Bank is required to give 3 months' notice if it intends to cancel any bank note. So that in the present scenario, where the $100 bill is about to be cancelled, if we had not amended the law, we would have had to wait a minimum period of 3 months. So if honourable senators would take a look at the bill before them and look at the new Section 27A, which reads as follows, 27A1, in addition to the powers of the bank under Section 27, the minister may direct the bank to cancel any note issued by it by giving not less than 14 days' notice published in the Gazette of the date of cancellation. So now the minimum period of notice is proposed to be reduced from the existing 3 months to 14 days. That is the first consequence of the new Section 27A1, proposed new section. On that day, on the day on which the banknotes are cancelled, which is called the appointed date. And if I go to the next page, just before clause 3, one will see under subsection 8 of clause 2, 27A, the new 27A, subsection 8, for the purposes of this section, the appointed day in relation to any note means the date of cancellation specified in the notice published in accordance with subsection 1. And subsection 1 is the one that now allows for a shorter minimum period of notice. And I'm stressing the word minimum because it could be more than that. It does not have to be strictly 14 days. And on that day, on the appointed day, the specified notes shall cease to be currency and be legal tender in Trinidad and Tobago, and shall be cancelled and be of no value. And what that would mean is that on the date of cancellation, the current paper note, it's actually a combination of cloth and paper, would cease to be valid tender. It will no longer be usable. You would not be able to exchange it in return for goods and services. It will no longer be valid tender. The 27A3 gives the bank, or directs the bank, to redeem at face value any specified notes which are presented for redemption prior to the appointed date, which, as I want to re-emphasize, is the date of cancellation of the banknote. What this means is if you show up with 10 $100 bills, existing paper bills, the bank has to redeem them for the new polymer bill. And the new polymer bill has a number of security features, and I want to say at the outset, this exercise has been driven by the Ministry of National Security based on national security considerations. And the Minister of National Security will elaborate on those security matters. 27A4, this is a precautionary clause. The bank shall redeem at face value any of the specified notes that are presented within the period of 3 months after the appointed date, if it is satisfied that the failure to present the notes for redemption prior to the appointed date resulted from circumstances beyond the control of the true owner of the notes, or that there was some other good or sufficient reason for the failure. And this is not going to be arbitrary or whimsical, because if you go to 27A5, sorry, not 27A5, 27A6 on the next page. I'll come back to 27A5 in a short while because it's a very important provision. 27A6 on page 3, the bank, with the approval of the minister, shall prescribe such conditions and procedures as it considers appropriate for the redemption of specified notes in accordance with subsections 3 and 4. And the important one now, as I speak, is 27A4, which speaks to the bank redeeming at face value notes that are presented within the period of 3 months after the date of cancellation for good and sufficient reason. And as I said, this will not be whimsical. The bank will prescribe the conditions and procedures for that scenario. I can give you an example, somebody who was out of the country, somebody who was in hospital, okay? But I wouldn't want to go anywhere beyond that. Those are just two typical examples I would give. I don't want to stray into areas which still have to be prescribed by order. Now, 27A5 is very, very important because this is not a perfect world. This exercise has been planned for a very long time. I will explain the difference between this exercise and other exercises in other countries and the precautions taken in a short while. But if for some unforeseen reason, when the date of cancellation arrives, whenever that date is, the view is that you need to extend the date, as we did with the amnesty, for example. The amnesty was extended for another 2 weeks, or a week. I can't remember exactly how long we extended it for, but we did extend it. if for some good and sufficient reason it is necessary to extend the date of cancellation, this will now give the minister, and in this particular section, this is the Minister of Finance, the power to extend the date of cancellation or to extend the 3-month period of redemption after the date of cancellation. Okay? And the other important clause in the clauses are clause 3, where section 55(3)(c) of the Proceeds of Crime Act is amended by deleting the words is $90,000 or such amount as. And clause 4 indicates that the regulation 11.1, which currently has the figure $90,000 in it, and $90,000 is what is called a large transaction. So that once a transaction of the amount of $90,000 takes place, there are requirements that a bank or a listed business has to follow with respect to audit, know your customer, due diligence, and so on, once a transaction of the amount of $90,000 takes place, of any kind, whether it is a cash transaction, whether it is a wire transfer, whether it is a check. Once it's 90,000, it's deemed to be a large transaction, and there are certain things that follow. If it's a cash transaction, the strictures are even more onerous in terms of due diligence and know your customer. So at the current time, the amount that will trigger activity and scrutiny for large transactions is $90,000. And what these amendments in 3 and 4 seek to do is to give, and this is now the Minister of National Security, this is no longer the Minister of Finance, because it's flowing from the Proceeds of Crime Act, and that is where these amounts are. The 55(3)(c) is now being amended to allow the minister to prescribe a figure that will no longer be 90,000. I don't want to say what it is. I'm afraid I must apologize to honorable senators. I am unable to tell you when the date of cancellation is, and I'm unable to tell you today what the new figure for a large transaction will be. That, I can assure you, will be made known very soon. Okay? So that what clauses 3 and 4 do is give the Minister of National Security the power to prescribe another figure, rather than where it is now. If you look at the law very carefully, you see it's fixed. There's no ability of the minister at this time to change it. He can't. So this is now giving the minister the ability to change the figure. Okay? Now there are few other things I want to say. For example, I would want to read from an article that looked at currency demonetization, because this is what it is. That's the technical term, demonetization, when you cancel or remove banknotes from circulation. In 1998, and I'm reading from the Mauritius Times, an article dated 26th of December 2016. And this article is about currency demonetization in Mauritius. Mauritius had to demonetize, that is, remove banknotes from circulation, the whole of its banknotes in 1998. All, not just the equivalent of a $1 or $10 or $20, the case may be. They had to remove the entire suite of banknotes that were in circulation in Mauritius. At that time in 1998, the objective was not to flush out of the system huge amounts of dirty money that had been hoarded by drug traffickers, money launderers, criminals, and so on. That was not the reason. The reason was that the Tamil script on the banknote was not properly printed on the banknote. And the matter went to court, believe it or not. I noticed Senator Timur is smiling, but this really happened. so that the Tamil script on the banknotes was not in the right place. The words they have here is that there was hierarchical displacement of the Tamil script. And the matter went to court, and the court ruled that every single banknote had to be replaced to correct whatever error there was with the printing of the Tamil script. What the Bank of Mauritius did at the time, and this is quite different from the Indian experience, because what happened in India is they just simply didn't have enough notes. So they were printing notes as they were going along, so that the banks ran out of notes, of the new note. I can't remember what size it was, 2,000 rupee or whatever it was. But when there was the problem in India, they simply did not have enough of the new notes. So that is what caused the confusion there, among other things. But what Mauritius did, and this is as far back as 1998, was to design and manufacture, print all of the new banknotes first before going ahead with the replacement. And we have done the same thing. So that we've learned from that lesson in Mauritius. So all of the new polymer notes have been manufactured. And I guess you realize with the traffic outside, I had to walk actually, I didn't mind. So an exercise is in progress. I would not say any more on that. But all of the new notes have been printed. And what happened in Mauritius is that, as I said, everything was done to ensure the banknotes were physically in place wherever they ought to be before the replacement. And this is what they actually said. The changeover was smooth and effective. There were no adverse economic repercussions. The only problem, and I suspect this will be quite possible in Trinidad and Tobago, which reflects the classic reaction of certain members of our population, this is Mauritius talking, was the last-minute turnout at commercial banks by numerous persons nearer to the day fixed for the final redemption of the impugned banknote issue, despite previous communiques having already informed the public of the deadline. So last minute. Now, Mauritius is very similar to Trinidad and Tobago. Population is almost identical. Their population is about 1.28 million. Our population is just over 1.3 million. The size of Mauritius is a little smaller than us, but they also have a diverse population similar to Trinidad and Tobago. So perhaps the culture is similar. So that in Mauritius, everybody waited until the last minute. And that happened in the amnesty as well, the recent tax amnesty. We had a line outside the door and BIR stretching all the way around to Independence Square. But what they said here, everybody was finally served. So that was the Mauritius experience in 1998. Since then, Mauritius has done demonetization at least twice again, in 2018 and 2019. And the last one I see here in Mauritius is that they have upgraded their 2,000 rupee note. They did that in 2018, 2019, and they did that to combat forgery, because that is one of the problems that we have. There are many problems with the $100 bill, but one of them is forgery. So what Mauritius did is that they replaced the entire set of 2,000 rupee banknotes with new bills with enhanced security features in order to prevent counterfeiting. And they've done another replacement of other notes in 2019. I'd also like to inform honorable members of Mauritius is interesting in terms of looking at what we are doing. In 2018, in July of 2018, there was a commission of inquiry on drug trafficking in Mauritius, and it reported in 2018. And I'm reading now from page 95 of the report of the Commission of Inquiry on Drug Trafficking in Mauritius, dated July 2018. And this is what the commissioners, the inquirers, had to say. Notorious drug traffickers are known to have amassed a fortune and they are being looked after by their accomplices or family members who are instructed to pay counsel, purchase property, movable or immovable, and the only way to deal with them is to hit at their pockets. The commissioners, in this Commission of Inquiry on Drug Trafficking in Mauritius just last year, and I'm reading verbatim now, the Commission recommends the government to consider seriously to issue a new generation of banknotes in replacement of the current banknotes, especially those of high denomination. This will compel financiers to exchange their, I will use the word, dirty money. So that what we are about is not new. It has been done in other countries before. And before I close, Mr. Vice President.
Minister, could you give way for a second?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Just, it would save us me having to stand up again. Just 3 questions. Would you have a sense of the value of the $100 denomination currency presently in circulation? And is this move part of what we need to do to become compliant with Global Forum and CFATF and these agencies?
This is actually a big win for Trinidad and Tobago with FATF and Global Forum, because it strikes at the heart of the underground economy, at tax evaders, at drug traffickers, at money launderers, who are the primary concerns of the Financial Action Task Force, the EU, and the Global Forum. So this is a big win if it works, and we expect it to, because we have planned it very well. This will be a big win for us in terms of our credibility with FATF and the Global Forum. Let me just say now, oh, I'm sorry, you want to know how much? There are 80 million $100 bills in circulation, a value of $8 billion. Not all of them are good. You know, some of them will be damaged and so on. But that's the figure I have, 8 million $100 notes. Sorry, 80 million $100 notes in circulation, a value of $8 billion. So I'm just now going to read from an article in a magazine called Money Matters, and the article is entitled, "What are the effects of," well, they use a term that I will not repeat, "What are the effects of dirty money?" And the way they describe dirty money is that they say it's a socio-economic evil, and that the major effects are a dual economy, a parallel economy operating side by side with the official or reported economy. So this affects official statistics. It affects statistics on money supply, on GDP, on sales, on consumption taxes like value-added tax and so on. When you have a significant underground economy or dual economy that is not reported, that does not appear in the official statistics, it could skew our understanding of the real economy of Trinidad and Tobago. And in most countries, in all countries, where there's a large underground economy, there is an underestimation of the true size and the true condition of the economy, because these statistics are not included in our GDP figures. Dirty money is largely attributed to tax evasion. Its direct impact is the loss of government revenue, because it's not reported. So it's not declared as income, so no tax is paid on it. We all know the places where we go to and they say, "You want a bill?" And of course, if you don't take a bill, it's not going to be recorded. Then the other problem with dirty money is lavish consumption spending, because you see people buying things, cars, motor cars, $1 million motor cars, that they can't possibly afford. I mean, we had an example recently of a fisherman buying a luxury motor car that he certainly could not possibly afford. Then you have, this goes without saying, general deterioration of the moral standards of society, because if dirty money becomes an accepted norm, you know, that you don't report it, it's generated by illicit activity, by drug trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering, and other serious crimes, then social values of honesty, hard work, thrift, and simplicity get eroded. so that I don't think there's anybody that would want to argue that there isn't an underground economy in Trinidad and Tobago. There is. The size of it, I am in no position to say. But there is an underground economy. We are a transshipment point for narcotics. Of that, I think everybody is aware. So that if and when this measure is successful, it should result eventually. It's an interesting thing, they say, in some countries where you had demonetization and people had to deposit. Savings went up in the bank, reported savings, because, of course, people have saved in a box under the mattress, whatever it is. But when currency is demonetized, you have to tender it. Some people may not want to walk around with large volumes of cash, so they'll deposit it, where they otherwise would have kept it at home in a box or whatever. So that the level of savings increases. So quite often the level of consumption increases. The level of economic activity increases. So that those are the positive aspects of demonetization. But I close by saying that this... Oh, certainly.
Honorable Minister, you did indicate that the value of the $100 notes amount to 80 million. Could you tell this Honorable House whether the equivalent was ordered? Could you tell or explain to this House whether the equivalent amount was ordered to replace that amount that is in circulation? Can you share with us?
Yes, Senator Mark, I mean, your voice is so soft. I almost don't recognize you. And I can't hear you. Clearly you're suffering from the flu or something like that. I understand it does hit you in the throat first. It's not 80 million in value, it's 80 million notes. It's $8 billion in value, but 80 million pieces of polymer, okay? And I am advised, again, this is being driven by the central bank. The central bank is the custodian of banknotes in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm advised by the governor of the central bank that they have procured an adequate supply of the new polymer $100 note. With those few words, Mr. Vice President, I simply want to say and repeat that this initiative is a national security initiative, and the role of the Ministry of Finance will be simply to support the Ministry of National Security in its effort. I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose a question for the debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Proceeds of Crime Act, Chapter 1127, and the Central Bank Act, Chapter 7902, be now read a second time. Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. And Mr. Vice President, thank you for giving me the opportunity on this wonderful Saturday to be here today to debate this very important bill, the Miscellaneous Provisions, Proceeds of Crime and Central Bank Act 2019. And Mr. Vice President, I think I can get away by coining and calling this bill the $100 bill. Because this is the framework or the legislation that the government intends to use in order to implement its policy with respect to the demonetization of the $100 note that currently is in circulation in Trinidad and Tobago. And according to the Minister of Finance, Mr. Vice President, is that the reason why the government has engaged in this task is so that they can clean up the dirty money, as he called it, and to, in a way, tackle the black market that currently exists in Trinidad and Tobago. And I heard that the Minister of National Security, Minister Stuart Young, yesterday in the other place, would have indicated that this would have helped with respect to the drug trade, the narcotics, and the firearms in terms of curbing financing of these illicit or illegal items, Mr. Vice President. But true, and it's a pattern by this government, that their legislative agenda is geared towards tackling white-collar crime, Mr. Vice President.
But just today in The Guardian, we have seen in the front page that there have been over 500 murders in Trinidad and Tobago. And this bill in itself is an attempt to try to help with respect to how items are found in criminals' hands, because it's a cash trade, Mr. Vice President, in order to buy these illegal firearms. And it's interesting, Mr. Vice President, in the editorial in today's Guardian, we see that it said that what is required is more than just legislative solutions. It requires the political will for tough actions that might be unpopular, but which will ultimately assist in setting the country back on a path of stability. And I say that, Mr. Vice President, because yes, we are here in the Parliament debating this present bill, which is probably one of the tools which this government is going to use to fight crime, because it's an attempt to try to curb money laundering in Trinidad and Tobago. But there are other things that has to be done. This cannot be the end-all, Mr. Vice President. It requires political will and it requires boots on the ground. And later on in my contribution, I will go on to explain, Mr. Vice President, that demonetization, in a sense, does not always deal with money laundering and curbing money laundering in Trinidad and Tobago. So, Mr. Vice President, as I use that as my introduction in terms of this particular piece of legislation, I want to say from the outset that the leader of the opposition and the members on this side of the House, we support the government in this measure, Mr. Vice President. We support the government with respect to this, but we also have questions to ask, and we seek clarification on behalf of ourselves and on behalf of the population, Mr. Vice President. And since the announcement came at the post-cabinet conference by the Minister of National Security on Thursday, much has been said, Mr. Vice President, with regard to this issue. And there is still some level of confusion in the minds of the population with respect to the formulation and the implementation of this particular policy of the government. Because when we pass this particular bill today, it means that government has the okay to go ahead and implement. And I think that is where the issue is, and that is the heart of the issue, that persons wonder, how is this going to work? What are the timelines, Mr. Vice President? These are some of the questions that the population they are asking on social media. You see it in the papers, the media today. You see it on TV, Mr. Vice President, that there are a lot of questions. There are a lot of clarification that is required with respect to this policy of the government. And we continuously hear this big word of demonetization being thrown around, and the Minister of Finance was correct when he said that it's just the cancellation or the discontinuance of the circulation of a particular note. And in this instance, we are discontinuing the $100 paper and, as the Minister said, cloth note to introduce the new $100 polymer note. And I'm sure everyone would have had a look at it because Central Bank had released what the new $100 bill would have looked like. But, Mr. Vice President, this is something that came 4 years late, because this is not a new policy of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, because former Governor Jabala Rambaran of the Central Bank introduced a policy and even got approval that all of the notes in Trinidad and Tobago, the $1, the $5, 10, 20, and $100 bill, would have been replaced with the polymer notes. I don't know what may have happened. I don't know if the Minister of Finance has any information of what would have happened to that particular decision and policy at the time with respect to replacing all of the notes. So, Mr. Vice President, I would just like to ask the Minister of Finance, and what is the reason that we are replacing only one note and we can't replace all of the notes at the same time? Is there some sort of resource issue or implementation issue with respect to this? Now, I agree that the polymer notes, they are very useful in terms of the safety of these notes, the security of these notes. It makes them almost impossible to counterfeit. And they're more durable than the paper note, Mr. Vice President. It is my understanding that the paper note, they're much cheaper to print, but they have a life of around 2 to 3 years, whereas the polymer notes may cost a little more, but their circulation is much longer. They can be circulated for up to about 7 years, Mr. Vice President. So it's actually a good move towards polymer instead of paper because of the security features and the lower level of counterfeiting, Mr. Vice President, when it comes to these particular notes. Now, the government rationale for the use of, for demonetization, as the Minister of National Security would have indicated, it's a national security issue for demonetization at this point in time, to combat money laundering, tax evasion, terrorist financing. But Minister of National Security, I know you will contribute in this debate. Can we as a Senate, because we have to make an informed decision at the end of the day, we require some sort of evidence in terms of the statistics with respect to money laundering and tax evasion, terrorist financing. Also, counterfeit is one of the biggest issue that we can combat using the new notes. And how can you just give us an indication with respect to the level of counterfeiting in Trinidad and Tobago and the forgery, Mr. Vice President? We heard the anecdotal evidence, we heard the presumptive, we heard the speculative reasons for this move. But we need to get down to the real data, the hard data and the evidence with respect to why the government is doing this at this particular time. The government indicated that this has been in planning for quite some time. So it meant that the government would have had enough research in their custody, they would have had the evidence within their custody in order to come with this policy at this particular time. And I will get to the timing, Mr. Vice President, because that is very important, that it comes at a very busy and high economic activity time in Trinidad and Tobago, which is the Christmas season, where a lot of persons tend to spend a little more at this time of the year. And Mr. Vice President, what I also looked at, and the Minister of Finance, he also looked at it too, is that what have other jurisdictions done when they have implemented a demonetization policy? And I saw, Mr. Vice President, that when the Soviet Union tried to do it, it didn't work. In North Korea, it didn't work, and they all do it with respect for security reasons. Myanmar, in Ghana, in Nigeria, demonetization led to sometimes the fall of a government or unforeseen and unwarranted turmoil in society in some of those jurisdictions, Mr. Vice President, and it's a reality. Now, in this case, no one wants that for Trinidad and Tobago. At the end of the day, we want well-intentioned legislation and policy so that all of us can live here in a country where persons would want to come to live, Mr. Vice President, and we feel comfortable and safe. But you must also learn from the experiences in other jurisdictions. The Minister of Finance alluded to India. And with respect to India, in 2016, it showed, Mr. Vice President, that when this experiment was done, there were job losses and closure of businesses, slower real GDP growth. The effects of demonetizations were lingering for 3 years after. Data from the Reserve Bank of India shows that 99% of the high-value old rupee notes were returned to the Indian banking system during demonetization, meaning, Mr. Vice President, that at the end of the day, that the criminals found more innovative and new ways in order to wash money. And this is something that we have to really think about, because this demonetization policy is really for money laundering. But will it really stop money laundering in Trinidad and Tobago? That is a question that we need to ask. Or will it fuel or funnel another trade? Because if you look at Ghana, when Ghana did it, and Ghana changed their local currency, you found that the foreign currency had a larger black market now, because it shows that the criminals migrate to using a different currency that can be traded in the particular jurisdiction. And this issue of demonetization, I submit humbly, will not curb money laundering, Mr. Vice President. I would admit, and I will give the government its congratulations, that it will assist with counterfeiting. But with respect to money laundering, it will not help. Because after the new currency comes on board, what prevents the criminals from still hoarding cash, Mr. Vice President? And that is a reality that we have to face right here in Trinidad and Tobago. We all accept that there's illegal and illicit activities. We all accept that there's a black market. As the Minister of Finance said, he doesn't have the information with respect to the size of that market. So we don't know the power of that market in terms of how, when these new notes come, there may be avenues in which they can still acquire and hoard these particular notes, Mr. Vice President. Now, I want to get directly to the clauses of the bill. When you look at clause 2 of the bill, which is really the crux of the bill, Mr. Vice President, it creates a concurrent power in the Central Bank Act, because this amends Section 27 of the Central Bank Act. Now, Section 27 of the Central Bank Act, Mr. Vice President, it's drafted a bit differently from what 27A is proposed in the bill. Now, Section 27, which I will call what is the existing law, it shows that the minister had some sort of limited power when dealing with demonetization. Secondly, that the minimum notice period given for the cancellation of notes would be 3 months. Now, if you would allow me to read, Mr. Vice President, 27(1) of the Act says that the bank, with the approval of the minister, may, on giving 3 months' notice, publish in the Gazette, call in any of its notes and coins on the payment of the face value thereof, and any such notes or coins with respect to which a notice has been given under this section shall, on the expiration of the notice, cease to be legal tender, but shall be redeemed at face value by the bank upon such conditions as may be prescribed. So it means that central bank, according to Section 27 of the Central Bank Act, was the real driver of demonetization. But they still require the approval of the minister. Now let's compare what is in the current act, the current bill, Mr. Vice President, because it's creating a concurrent power. 27A1 reads that in addition to the powers of the bank under Section 27, which I just quoted, the minister may direct the bank to cancel any note issued by it by giving not less than 14 days' notice published in the Gazette of the date of cancellation. So now it means that the minister becomes the driver of the process of demonetization. So there are two options that are really being created here after this amendment. One, central bank carries the process. Second one, minister carries the process, but with a shorter notice period. Now, there are commentators that will criticize this particular legislation by saying, well, listen, if the minister now directs central bank to do something, it means that you are chipping away or you are eroding at the independence of central bank. And Mr. Vice President, we will all appreciate in this House that central bank is really the institution that is responsible for fiscal policy and fiscal management and monetary policy, Mr. Vice President. So that is one of the criticisms that we can make when it comes to this new power being given to the minister in this particular instance. Now, Mr. Vice President, when we look at the time frame, because this is a very important issue, I must admit, Minister of Finance, through you, Mr. Vice President, that I was disappointed that we did not get the date, the appointed date, which will be the date of cancellation, and also what will now constitute a large sum transaction. But I will focus on the appointed date, because as the Minister rightly pointed out, that once the notice is given that there's going to be a cancellation, the date of cancellation will be stated on the notice. Notice is published in Gazette. It's notice to the entire world, Mr. Vice President. Now, we are here on a Saturday debating this particular piece of legislation. We came here that the government has to act with some level of urgency. So I expected, Mr. Vice President, that at least we should have been shown a little more respect in this particular Senate so that we would have known what the appointed date is, or even the date on which the notice is to be made. Because it seems as though that we are here on a Saturday, it means that the government wants to publish this notice on Monday, because we sit on Tuesday. So if the government couldn't wait until then, it means that they have to act with some sort of alacrity on Monday for us to be here on the Saturday, Mr. Vice President. So we must know, we must be given some sort of explanation why it is that this is going to be done in such a rush and hurried manner, Mr. Vice President. I think we deserve that level of respect in this particular Senate of why we are here debating this in such a rush, hurried manner. Because we got no, I could say we probably didn't even get 24-hour notice of this particular piece of legislation. It came very late yesterday afternoon. And Mr. Vice President, we need to know also what exactly is the time frame that the citizens are going to be getting for the exchange of these notes. And although the government said that this has been planning for a long period of time, respectfully, Mr. Vice President, we have heard several quarters that the timing of this particular piece of, the timing of the implementation, in fact, not the legislation, the implementation may be a bit troublesome, Mr. Vice President. Because when you look at the large amounts of exchange that has to be done within a 14-day period, if the minimum period is had, if the government is going to give the 14-day period, you would imagine, Mr. Vice President, what will happen to the commercial banks in Trinidad and Tobago. Because if the minister indicated that there are 80 million $100 notes in Trinidad and Tobago, you would very well imagine what will be happening at the commercial banks in Trinidad. And I do plead with the government that you give a reasonable time frame with respect to the cancellation. Because this is a very busy time in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, we also want to know, Mr. Vice President, because you see, I was happy to see that the minister reserved the power that he can extend the date of cancellation by order, so we don't have to come back to the Parliament. It can be done very easily and very conveniently. But there are some issues that have been raised in the public domain, and I think having the opportunity today, I should also raise these issues. And I know that my colleague and friend, Senator the Honorable Kazim Hussein, he would also be aware of some of these issues. And yesterday, Mr. Vice President, a group concerned Muslims of Trinidad and Tobago, Imtiaz Mohammed, they had a press conference. And they raised some of the concerns that they may have had with respect to that particular issue. And Mr. Vice President, the background and the teachings of Islam is one that Muslims do not indulge in interest-bearing accounts. It's called riba, and you don't deposit your monies to intermix or intermingle with interest. It's illegal in the religion. It's haram in the religion, Mr. Vice President. And now, this raises several questions because Muslims, some Muslims may tend to keep their money home, Mr. Vice President, instead of banking it in interest-bearing accounts. So, when this particular law is passed and the implementation starts, some of these persons who have been saving may not have proper records, notwithstanding that they would have had legitimate means of earnings, Mr. Vice President. Another instance is that of the Hajj. Persons who, especially older persons, they would have saved for probably 7, 10, 12 years to make the holy pilgrimage. It cost about $50,000 to $70,000 on an average to make the holy pilgrimage. And you'd imagine, Mr. Vice President, that at that age, nobody is going to take a record keeping of how they are going to be saving for their pilgrimage. That they're not going to say, okay, this week I saved $1,000, and last week I got this from my nephew or my son or my daughter. It's going to be difficult for these persons who have legitimate incomes and savings to now go to the bank and have their monies exchanged because the bank policy is very rigid. So that is one of the issues that came out after the announcement with respect to this. And I hope that the minister becomes very sensitive to this issue because a power is reserved to you, minister, under the bill, which is at 27A sub 6, where the minister, where the bank, with the approval of the minister, may prescribe such conditions and procedures as it considers appropriate for the redemption of the specified notes in accordance with Section 3 and 4. So the minister has that power reserved for him, so where he can have or make special procedures or prescribe special procedures and conditions to deal with situations like that. Mr. Vice President, there have been elderly persons who don't go to the bank also, who save their monies at home. They also would be affected. They have legitimate savings, Mr. Vice President, but may not be able to show a paper trail, Mr. Vice President. You have farmers, you have parlors, you have taxi drivers in this country, food establishments, Mr. Vice President, who may not have proper bookkeeping in order to now go to the bank and say, look, I have this amount of cash, you give me the new notes. They may not be able to do so through source of funds, Mr. Vice President, which can create an impediment. I also want to ask a question now, that if the bank refuses to exchange the notes with particular individuals, and the date of cancellation comes, and this person continues to hold the old notes, through Mr. Vice President, to the Minister of Finance, that they will now be deprived of their monies because they would not be able to tender those notes legally, because you can only tender what the new notes are. I don't know if I'm clear to the Minister. If individual X goes to the bank refuses to exchange the money for some reason or the other, the date of cancellation passes, the person continues to hold the old note. At that point in time, that old note is null and void. Therefore, it amounts to some sort of deprivation of property, because at the end of the day, money is property. So, and those persons may not, as I said earlier, will have legitimate sources of income and earnings and savings, but may not be able to properly account for it. Those are instances, Mr. Vice President, through you to the Minister, that you have to be sensitive to. We have to be sensitive to those things, and as I said again, I'm glad that you reserve that power unto yourself, Minister, in order to make those prescribed conditions and procedures. Maybe it can be used to help and bring relief to those situations.
Just want to let you know I'm familiar with the concept of REBA and other extenuating circumstances that might cause a delay. But of course, this is something that the central bank has to prescribe the conditions, but with the approval of the minister. So I'm listening to you very carefully. Okay? I'll give you that assurance. I'm listening to you very carefully.
Thank you very much, Minister. I will tell them. They know. Mr. Vice President, another one of the issues that have been raised is that of ATMs. ATMs are they're specially designed machines. Especially again at this time, you would have a lot of persons using the ATM for withdrawals of cash. Now, with respect to this specific polymer note, Mr. Vice President, I wonder whether or not the banks have been consulted properly to put the necessary upgrades in terms of the software and hardware with the ATMs. Because I am made to understand that when Aruba conducted their demonetization, it took up until 6 months for the ATM machines to be adjusted with their new polymer notes. So at this point in time, Mr. Vice President. Already? Okay, thank you, Mr. Vice President. I would like to know whether or not enough consultation was done with the banking industry with respect to the ATMs. Also, the cash counting machines also have to be dealt with because of the thickness and the dimensions of the note. No. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I was taken by surprise when you told me 5 more minutes. But I don't know if I will be able to use off my 15 minutes, Mr. Vice President. But nonetheless, I have some more issues to raise. One person contacted me yesterday afternoon who works in a commercial bank. And they indicated that yesterday, and Minister, I know you would have anticipated this, is that the panic has already started. That persons are going into the banks to make their deposits who have cash at their homes. I am made to understand that up until one commercial bank yesterday was servicing customers up until 7 p.m. Because there was a rush in that particular bank. And also the issue that I raised earlier was that some persons were not being attended to giving the service that they went for because they were not able to account through source of funds for their earnings, Mr. Vice President. So the issue it's happening already. You have a lot of panic in the population with respect to this particular issue. And I think, Minister, to help this is that you need proper communication with the population. I think we are all in this particular issue together with respect to fighting money laundering, especially at a critical time like this for Christmas. I think let the population get the information. And that is why we are here. We're here to give critical support to the government. And that critical support comes from asking questions so that we can have more information available to the population with respect to this particular issue. Again, I ask that you inform us of the timing. Why are we hurrying this particular piece of legislation? What is the particular rush? Yesterday, the bill was first reading, second reading, third reading, and passage in the other place. Today, it's going to be the same thing. We're here on a Saturday. Can you give us an indication of why this particular rush with respect to this legislation? Also, Minister, you could also inform the Senate of what consultations were done prior to the implementation of this policy. I know yesterday yourself and Minister Young would have met with BAT, the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago. We don't know what the nature of the meeting was, but we know that there was some sort of meeting yesterday, and the president of BAT would have given an indication that they're ready. We must listen to the business community, the San Fernando Chamber, DOMA, San Juan Business Association, and the Supermarkets Association. They all welcome the initiative, but at the same time, they question the timing of this particular policy. Nobody is against the government with respect to this, Mr. Vice President, but the timing is what is very worrisome to the population. And you have 4 major groups coming out to indicate that they have some issue with respect to the timing. So maybe the government will give us some clarity or some clarification with respect to this particular issue. Now, with the amendment of the Proceeds of Crime Act, I want to say that, again, I express my disappointment that we don't know what will now constitute a large sum transaction. It has now been removed from $90,000 to the sole discretion of the minister who will publish by order. We don't know whether or not it's an increase from the $90,000 that will constitute a large sum transaction, or it will be a decrease. I think when we pass laws in the Parliament, there must be some level of certainty. And especially when it comes to the business sector, there must be some sort of certainty with respect to these issues. And I express my disappointment that the finance minister, especially at this critical stage, is unable to provide us with what would constitute a large sum transaction, the Minister of National Security. So those are the issues that I wish to raise, Mr. Vice President. Now, we have done our part in this particular Parliament. We are giving the support. In the other place, we gave the support to the government with respect to this. Now it's up to them. They are now on the field. We gave them the support. Now the government is there. Let us see if they can do this thing properly. They boast about getting it done. Let's see if you all will get this done. I know on last Monday, you didn't get it done. But let's hope that you get the currency and the demonetization policy done, Mr. Vice President. And just to end off, I know I was not very political today, but I can't help myself, Mr. Vice President, that I was scrolling through Facebook, and I happened to come across a post. And the post reads this, Mr. Vice President. It's from a concerned citizen. They ask if we're feeling like Venezuela yet. Long gas lines, no forex blackouts, no water, job losses, business closing, high crime rate, 5 months for a passport, late payments of salary, no medicine in hospitals, no beds in hospitals. Mr. Vice President, are we feeling like Venezuela yet? But then I already expressed this morning, and one citizen said that do not change the money. What we need to do is change the government. And I thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Timal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute on this debate on an act to amend the Proceeds of Crime Act, Chapter 1127, and the Central Bank Act, Chapter 7902. Mr. Vice President, there is no doubt that the decision taken by the government for this intended demonetization of the $100 bill is for the welfare of the nation. But as I stand here, I'm sure a fair amount of what I have to say in the next couple of minutes would have been probably preempted if, although the bill was piloted by the Minister of Finance, we have not heard yet from the Minister of National Security. And it's unfortunate Senate procedure, takes the debate in a certain area, because the Minister of National Security, being the major initiator of this piece of legislation, I'm sure would have provided answers to a lot of what I have to say. But I still plug ahead. The main question surrounding this piece of legislation is whether the outlined measures would achieve the objectives intended by the government. Because from what I'm gathering, the main objectives seem to be eradication of counterfeit currency, particularly with the $100 bill, maybe to some extent tax evasion, and of course, the undermining of the industry of money laundering, or dirty money, as we refer to it. And in addition to those objectives, Mr. Vice President, is if we can clearly understand from the government in their subsequent presentations here to the House today, is whether there are any projected impacts on the economy, and in particular in the budget that was just presented for the year 2020, whether positive or negative impacts on that particular budget due to this particular piece of legislation. The legislation, Mr. Vice President, appears to be, to me, to be based on a major assumption that the owners of dirty money, of laundered money, have their money in cash. That seems to be the major assumption to me. And do they really keep all their money in cash, buried in buckets under the earth, under mattresses, or any other innovative measures of hiding cash? And I am of the view that really the large guys in this money laundering, in the hoarding of dirty money, the big ones as we see, actively seek to convert their money into tangible and intangible assets as fast as they can, such as properties, jewelries, gold, stock markets, and other similar type assets. But I would trust that the other legislation that this House has passed over the years, particularly in regards to the FATF, fulfilling FATF requirements like the Unexplained Wealth Act and all of these things, would provide a net for these type of diversion of cash into illegal cash into the acquiring of legal assets. But I would want to think that the money launderers, as quickly as possible, would seek to convert their cash into these valid assets. And as a result, the cash being held by the money launderers would really be a volume of cash that would facilitate operational expenses, maybe over a short period of time, so that they are able to transact their illegal businesses. And as such, this attempt may just be able to pull in just that short-term operational cash that is in the system illegally. Mr. Vice President, another aspect is that the big players in this game, the big players in the money laundering game would be conducting a certain amount of their business in US dollars. And as such, this intended action by the government would miss that aspect of the money laundering. And I'm not sure. I think we are not sure really in terms of the extent of this cash in US dollars, but from what we hear, what we understand is that particularly in the drug trade, a lot of transactions are really conducted in foreign currency, in US dollars. And as such, again, this measure, we may be missing the opportunity, or we may be missing the necessity, rather, to capture the big fish, the big players in this in illicit activities. So, is it that this measure would only affect the small fry, and at that for just a while, for just to overcome a temporary loss in operational monies, and after a fairly short period of time, they are back into the business with valid, legitimate polymer $100 bills. Mr. Vice President, is this policy also going to create a new laundering scheme of subcontracting or subletting of laundered money so that persons could make deposits on behalf of those persons with large amounts of cash? What I'm saying is that, for instance, someone using their family members, members of an extended family, members of gangs, employees of businesses, and a series of small businessmen who engage in a lot of subcontracting and subletting and all of these things, where large sums of cash are broken up, given to these smaller entities, given to these different individuals to make smaller deposits. And when the money is legitimized through the issue of legal tender, then that money is passed back to the launderer, but of course at a commission. And this is what I understand from reading some of the material on post-demonetization in India. This is what happened a lot, where the guys with large sums of money were able to escape the net intended by the demonetization of certain currencies. And I would like to hear if this possibility has been considered by the government, and what measures could be put in place or they intend to put in place to deal with this possibility. Mr. Vice President, we are entering a phase with this legislation of what, and I don't think I'm being dramatic, what I could term economic shock. There is $8 billion in circulation due to the $100 note. And from what I understand, I've been informed by my senatorial colleague that this approximates to 90% of currency in circulation. So something affecting 90% of the currency in circulation, it is going to have an impact on everyday life. It's going to have an impact on life over the coming months, and probably the experiences of some countries, even years. And I am I would like the government to advise whether or not mitigation effects were looked at to counteract some of the negative impacts of this demonetization. Because our Minister of Finance in his presentation did draw the example of Mauritius. And I think at one point in time, he did mention that this legislation, there was a long planning time, to order, I guess it would be to order the currency notes, get them printed, get them here and everything. It's a process. So the planning phase would have been quite substantive. And bearing in mind that demonetization has been tried in several jurisdictions over the years, not only Mauritius, but we have heard India, Nigeria, and all of these countries, is whether a due diligence was conducted on the negative impacts of the demonetization on those countries. And a clear identification of the negative impacts has been there, and also whether efforts were made to clearly identify mitigation effects that we should put in place as a nation, to minimize the impact on the country. Because, let's face it, the majority of persons with cash savings, cash at homes and whatever it may be, would be those who are innocent in this whole process. Sure, they are the money launderers, but, Mr. Vice President, there is no doubt that a significant number of innocent persons would be caught up in this transition. And Senator Saddam Hussein mentioned about the religious tradition of one of, of the Muslims. But also, I'd like to point out, it is within the cultural DNA of our people, part of our cultural DNA, to really put aside some cash at home, particularly within extended families and even the nuclear families. Primarily not because of any ill intentions, but really primarily because a lot of times you tell yourself in a case of emergency, say there's a natural disaster, the ATM machines are not functioning or the banks have problems and all of these things. It is always a comforting, thing to know that you can have access to some cash. And of course, that amount is going to vary based on the lifestyle and the expenses of certain families. But I'm sure that cash that is put aside for emergency and for that sense of well-being could amount to a fairly decent amount of money, particularly when you are thinking if conditions last for maybe 2 weeks or a month, and you want to put aside some monies in that case. So the whole thinking about it culturally, I think, is that we do have a significant number of innocent persons who will have a fair amount of cash in their homes. And it brings me back to the point of the mitigation of these adverse impacts. And I would like to hear from the government, what campaigns, what plans do they intend to put in place for public awareness and public education regarding this piece of legislation? Because in the long gestation, in the planning to implement this, my feeling is that sufficient attention should have been given, or I'm sure would have been given, to charting out public awareness, education campaign in which clear, definitive guidance and instructions are provided to the public in all forms of media, not just Facebook, but in order to lessen the anxiety that a lot of our citizens will be suffering from with this piece of legislation. The other thing is in terms of the future interaction and consultation with the banks and the banking association. In terms of particularly how are the banks going to engage with the public in this regard? Is it going to be business as usual? Same banking hours? Because there are a lot of times I go to the bank and a simple transaction, and maybe just a simple withdrawal or something, sometimes I stand in that line for 1 hour. And from what I understand, it's a common experience of a lot of people that a basic banking transaction could take you from half an hour to an hour. And here we are in a situation that is going to increase that traffic within the banks. And whether or not we are going to engage with the banks regarding extended banking hours, regarding increasing staff to deal with this increase in volume of banking transactions that would come about because of this legislation. Mr. Vice President, inevitably I think there are going to be long queues. And those long queues are going to extend outside of the bank. In fact, they even do for just normal transactions on a month-end Friday. And the queues extending out of the bank, the exposure of persons within the line, everybody watching at each other to see what size bag they have. If somebody with a big bag like this or a small bag, we boy, that man have plenty of money. And not from that point of view, but our seasoned criminals and those guys in the business of crime, being able to observe our citizens in queues and all of these things with maybe visible signs of fair amount of cash. Not that they may attack them in the queue, but take note of those persons, and when the money is exchanged, take note of them and where they are heading back with those monies. So I think consultation with the police and in all banking locations, I think the impact in terms of additional patrols is the police, Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. Do they intend to come out with all the resources and SRP and everything to ensure that citizens who have to line up and all of those things, the security aspect is looked at? And Senator Saddam Hussein did raise the point that, the criteria that the banks are going to use to accept or reject monies. I mean, what is the criteria? The minister did mention about reviewing the limit of $90,000. But is that really the limit going to be reduced downwards? So somebody showing up with $10 or $20 or $30 or $40,000, is subject to all of the requirements coming out of FATF legislation and everything. And what happens if they are turned away by the bank? Are we going to give the banks the authority to sit as a final arbitrator in deciding what cash they take and what they do not take? And in a queue, waiting for hours, who is going to really make an assessment within the bank? The teller takes it to a floor supervisor, the floor supervisor has to take it to a manager while you are in a queue. I mean, what are the systems within the bank that is going to be put in place to really deal effectively with this thing? I think that consultation with the bankers through the Banking Association, I hope that that is some of the intended consultations that has to be that government intends to take up with the bankers. So, Vice President, as I said at the beginning, measures, and sometimes very tough measures, have to be taken to really bring order and to really ensure that our nation prospers by the legal conduct of persons and the legal conduct of business. And really and truly, I am in support of the legislation, but it's just my biggest concern is really how we intend to educate, make the public aware over the coming weeks, and how we intend to mitigate all, how we intend to clearly identify and mitigate all negative impacts on those innocent members of the public. I thank you.
Senator Obika. Who's next? Senator Choate.
Okay.
Mr. Vice President, quite frankly, I was still doing some of my research, but I suppose in moments of crisis, somebody has to get to their feet. So, I don't know if the standing orders. Yeah. I don't know if the standing orders provide for that. I consider this to be an exceptional sitting because it's not often. I think since I have been in the Senate, we have been brought out on one occasion to deal with legislation, and that had to do with the fixing of the date of elections, I believe, for the Tobago House of Assembly. We really didn't have a choice. I do think that more time ought to have been given to us with respect to consideration of this proposed legislation. Certainly, I kept checking my computer repeatedly to see when we were going to get a draft of this legislation. I even went up on the Gazette site to see if I could find it there. There was nothing. There was nothing on Parliament's website for the public to see and so on. And I really deplore, quite frankly, that approach to introducing legislation which will have a very high impact on every aspect of our lives. Now, I will approach this first as a lawyer, and I will look at Clause 2, which creates a Section 27A, which says that in addition to the powers of the bank, the minister may direct the bank to cancel any note issued by it giving not less than 14 days' notice published in the Gazette of the date of cancellation. There are 4 observations which I wish to make about 27A. 1, having reread the Central Bank Act, I realized that entrenched in that piece of legislation is the policy that the central bank must have a strong degree of independence from political control. So while it is that in many instances ministerial approval is sought, there is nothing, well, it could be that I missed it because of the short period of time given for research, but I saw nothing which provided for ministerial directive as this 27A does. Now, if we are changing from with the approval of the minister to the minister may direct, which in law has an entirely different meaning, then I think we ought to have been told what was the reason for the change in formula. Secondly, many people have focused on the fact, or at least the public has been focusing on the fact that we are talking about the $100 note. And to some extent, I have a lot of sympathy for this because I realize that demonetization, and especially with respect to $100 notes, you would be hitting a lot of criminal enterprises pretty hard. I'm all for that. But by saying here any note, basically what you're saying is we are preparing for wholesale demonetization. This is what we are legislating for. So this is, if we are doing that, then let us appreciate that it's not only the $100 bill we are talking about. I do take the point, Senator Hussain has spoken quite a bit about it, and I agree. I think 14 days is a bit of short notice. And if there was a particular reason for the 14-day period, if there was a particular reason given, then I could understand it, because when I look at other jurisdictions, I see that more time was given. In fact, there was, massive public education programs in different territories and so on to tell people what demonetization was about and what impact it would have on them. In India, for example, they attempted to demonetize on 3 occasions. And I will refer to some of the other territories where demonetization has been considered and put in place. So I do have some difficulty with what is contained in 27A, because I think the purport of this amendment, when the Honorable Minister made his presentation, is quite different from what I see here in black and white. Now, I always say when I speak on matters such as these, I don't have a head for financial matters, so it could be that I am not seeing something or reading something incorrectly, but on a straight reading of the plain meaning of the language, I see that we have some difficulties with respect to that. Now, with respect to the proposed amendment to Section 55(3)(c) of the Proceeds of Crime Act, with the deletion of the amount of $90,000, or as the minister may by order prescribe, I think the minister already has the power to prescribe. So we ought to get an idea of what is the benchmark if $90,000 is going to be replaced by another figure. Otherwise, it doesn't lead to financial certainty. It doesn't lead the public to get an idea of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And when it comes to making financial arrangements, I think clarity is something that we should aim for. Financial arrangements above anything else, clarity is what we should aim for. So that is my little critique of the legislation as it is drafted. But I do wish to refer to some academic literature that I picked up in the short time that we were given. In particular, an article which I saw in the Journal of Emerging Technologies and Innovative Research. It's 2018, Volume 5, Issue 9. And its title is Examining the Post-Waves of Demonetization on the Indian Economy, a Conceptual Review. Now, India, as I said, is on its 3rd demonetization. So I suppose, I would not like to only focus on India, because there are many differences between their economy and ours, and so on. So this article helpfully provided me with examples of other regions which demonetized and the effect. Ghana in 1982. Seems as though when they demonetized, there was greater support for the black market because people continued to use currency, I suppose, as they used to use, livestock in the past as payment, and as a medium for exchange. So it had nothing, it had very little impact on the black market. Nigeria did it in 1984. Inflation rose. Soviet Union, 1991, negative results. Even Australia, which is a developed country, which did it in 1996, can only say that its impact on its economy was moderate. North Korea, 2010, people had no money, no food, lost homes. Zimbabwe, 2015, same sort of thing. India, which is perhaps the more recent one and the most publicized one, because there was a huge campaign which came before this demonetization. There was a massive campaign in a massive country. So naturally, what was taking place there was easily accessible to those of us in the rest of the world. And what they had was a loss of GDP. And one commentator said that it was good for banks, but not for anybody else. Now, the Guardian newspaper, I'm talking about the English Guardian of the 30th of August, 2018, suggested that when India demonetized, 1.5 million people lost their jobs, and there was a 1% drop in GDP. So I think, an education program or some sort of information to our people at a time when companies are shutting down. Over the last year, people have been without work. People have lost their jobs. They're facing a Christmas, for many people, of hardship. I think if we are going to take a step like this, then we ought to have the courtesy and respect for our people to prepare them, to say, okay, while at first you may think that it doesn't look that good, it doesn't feel that good in your pockets, this is the greater good that we are aiming at. And with all due respect, I don't think that we have done that, and that is a disservice to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. I came to the example of Venezuela last because it's so close to home. And Venezuela demonetized its 100 Bolivar note in 2016. And it resulted in a severe shortage of currency in the country. And well, we all know what happened thereafter. We are living with the impact of that. So demonetization, in principle, is not something that I oppose or I object to, because there are many pluses to go with it. I think crime fighting is one of the many pluses. I think when you demonetize, you hit the pockets of people like terrorists, money launderers, the big fish, as it were. And I could understand why the temptation may have been to put it for 14 days, because it would sort of narrow the window for these people to convert their cash into other assets and thereby not lose by demonetization. So I get that, but in the balancing act, I think that perhaps what we ought to consider is the greater impact it will have on the other citizens in our society, and especially at this time of the year. So while it is that, theoretically speaking, I am willing, with some convincing, to support this kind of legislation, I really do think we ought to clear up some of the issues which have been raised, not only by me, but by other senators in this House, and also to explain to us what's the urgency. Can we please beg for some time for the law-abiding citizens and push this back a bit? till later in the month when they would have had more time to absorb the implications of this on their lives. And if we can't do that, then we ought to be told why. What is the urgency of this? So, Mr. Vice President, thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I rise to ask a few questions, which I hope would be responded to either by the minister in his wrapping up or any other contributor from the government side. It will be very important for the government to assure not just the public, but the business community that by virtue of the powers being bestowed upon the minister or any other government minister by virtue of the changes in this legislation would not amount to any erosion of the autonomy of the central bank. There have been public noises in the media. As one will be aware, Mr. Vice President, this is a very topical issue, and it will be very important for the government not only to state that they are not eroding the autonomy of the central bank, but also give grounds for that claim so that persons can believe the argument of the government in this case, given that monetary policy, whilst government must have a hand in it, the central bank governor must be entrusted to basically run with monetary policy as he sees fit. Now, given the revelation of the Minister of Finance that 8 billion TT dollars roughly, well, just short of 8 billion TT dollars when you take away the mutilations, in terms of the notes held in circulation for TT $100 bills, it will be interesting for the minister in contemplating an extension, so this is not a technical issue now, to have a threshold minimum limit because of notes that should have been recalled. For example, let's say for instance we accept the argument that the 8 billion value, 80 million notes is an estimation. And when the final count is in, they get 75 million notes in. So there's still more than 5% of the outstanding estimated notes still in circulation. The government may want to either determine if they have in fact collected all, and in fact the estimation was an overestimation, or B, try to go to different sectors of the population who may still have notes that are around, but basically do not a house to house, but utilize the services of the Ombudsman and offices of the Ministry of Finance and the warden offices and so on, to basically use public education to get to persons, categories of persons who may still have sums of monies, who may have either missed the deadline or who may not be aware still of it, because we can't assume that every citizen would be aware at the material point in time of the issue, even though we would expect all persons to be zoned in on this particular issue, as it is topical and affects everyone. So that minimum threshold, I would advise, even if it's an internal minimum threshold, they don't need to tell the population necessarily, but it would be good policy for them to have that information at hand. The second thing would be a heightened, would there be, so this is a question for the government, I guess the Minister of National Security, as he's present, to respond to. Would there be a heightened police presence or national security presence, call out the army, for instance, as has been done today in Port of Spain, to give persons the trust that when they go to the banks with their sums of money, because for some person, their $1 million might be $25,000. For some person, their $1 million might be $5,000. So if persons are sure when they pass by the bank, by the credit union, by the microfinance house, wherever they go to change, they are allowed to change the funds, they see a visible presence of the police, a visible presence of the army, in case the police will be involved in fighting crime. The Christmas season is very known for increased criminal activity. So with a visible presence of the army, at least, it may give persons the confidence to go back to the financial institution of their choice and deposit funds to retrieve it. So that's one question for the Minister of National Security to respond to. And we will be looking on to ensure that that is done, because that would be a key issue as persons are trying to get their funds changed. Another issue would be the format. So in the public education, Mr. Vice President, as someone who worked in the banking sector, even though the $90,000 threshold limit is mentioned for source of funds, citizens would really want to take into account that even if you come with $5,000 and the teller is not convinced, or the supervisor is not convinced of the means by which you've come into this $5,000, they are within their right to ask you what exactly was the source. Now, if they fail to do so, they still have the opportunity to note that internally, that someone brought some funds, and in their view, it's suspicious. It may not constitute an unusual activity report that will go to FIU, but it may be fed into the Know Your Customer at the compliance department of the financial institution. If someone, I'll give a simple example. If you're going to send funds via Western Union, they are required to ask you, what was the source of your funding? They're also required to ask you what they're using the funds for. So persons may hear of the 90,000 figure, and they may also understand it's not a static figure as well. If over a period of time someone decides, okay, to smurf it, they will send persons to distribute 80,000, so it falls below the threshold. The bank is also empowered to say, okay, the cumulative figure that you've sent within this last 5 days is above the 90,000 figure. They can ask you. Whether you are compelled to respond is a different thing, and that is a question of law. But even if you don't respond, the staff at the bank is required to file an internal report on you. So it is important at this time, I believe also for the government, to empower the central bank to engage in public education in case the central bank doesn't have the funding for it, because this will have to be national public education to assist them if they don't have the funding or the staffing or the mechanism to do so, to engage in such public education. The source of funds, so that's the issue where that is concerned. The other issue I want to raise has to do with reasons for non-compliance. Senator Timal spoke of our culture in this country to store funds. Someone maybe, the minister of finance indicated that persons may be ill. They may be, I want to ask if they extend that to persons who family members may say that they may be suffering from senility, for example. Because if someone is starting to forget, as we say in Trinidad and Tobago, then one, it can stand to reason that they may also forget that they have funds saved in different places in their house, which would have been required to send to the bank to change. There's also the culture of the susu, Mr. Vice President. Someone may have in their possession funds, and susu hands may take some time before it comes in. Sometimes if someone is holding the box, as we say, for the susu, it might take 2 weeks before they get all the funds in, and then they disburse them to persons, their hands to persons. At that material time, when they start to collect those funds and they disburse, they may be hard-pressed to find themselves at a financial institution with other people's money. And it may present them some difficulty because they may be feared that they'll be robbed. And that brings me back to my initial request, that across the length and breadth of Trinidad and Tobago, that we call out the army, as we say, and we have them stationed at places that can provide persons with increased comfort, so that they know that when they are working with their sums of money, they can they can be comforted. And I want to end on because just some questions I wanted to raise. I want to end on the point of when persons go to the bank and persons ask them, even if it's not $90,000 and they only have $5,000, bank training, credit union training, mandates frontline staff to ask persons. And so it will be important for the government to explain the law broadly, so in the event that banks are asking questions that they should not ask persons, the government makes it very clear what is required in the event that banks, credit unions, other financial institutions that are involved in exchanging funds on behalf of the central bank, they make it very clear to the population what questions they must answer and what questions, if they do not answer, even if they are not required to answer in law, can result in the bank's compliance department framing a suspicious characterization of them in terms of the nature of their transactions. A simple example is this. When persons are engaging in money laundering, they may choose to use Smurfs. From the show we've seen growing up as children, you have one person with $1 million, and they find 20 persons or 100 persons with $100,000 on average each. And they will send them to the banks to deposit. So therefore, they watch their funds. If someone in the bank, Mr. Vice President, is suspicious because of the community the persons are coming from, the number, the closeness of the persons, and the proximity of the transaction, they may decide, especially even after interviewing one of the persons, because someone may be forthright and tell them, well, this big man gave me this money and he gave plenty of money to come to the bank. They may decide to start profiling persons. The question would be, what questions citizens must answer? And what questions, even if they are not required to answer in law, would result in the bank framing a suspicious characterization of them based on the nature of the transaction, based on who it's purported to be connected to, and then result in them having difficulties with the law in terms of being flagged. So I think the government would be well placed to take not only the support of the opposition in this regard, but also to take into consideration all the questions that have been asked and also frame the public education in such a way that it can reduce the hardship among citizens. And of course, bring out national defense to protect persons when they go to do their transactions. I thank you.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I'd like to start this afternoon's presentation and contribution by thanking all of the members of the Senate for realizing and understanding the importance of this Saturday's sitting and for willingly attending and for all of the contributions that I've heard thus far. All of the contributions, respectfully, Mr. Vice President, have raised very sensible, predictable, and important questions and considerations. And I'm happy to assure that in listening to the speakers before, to assure the public that every single one of the questions raised or the issues raised or the matters raised have already been thought of and addressed by the government and, importantly, by the central bank. So that's a good note, Mr. Vice President, to start this afternoon's proceedings by again repeating that this policy decision of the government of Trinidad and Tobago is driven by national security concerns. To quickly, before I get into the national security concerns as far as I can go, to quickly then make the most important point. There are a few very important points, and this is one of them. Government has taken a decision. We are here as legislators to pass the necessary legislation to allow that decision to be implemented, and to be implemented by the independent arm of the central bank, and to give the assurance that the administration and implementation of this decision lies with the central bank. Because it is not unusual for a government to take a decision to change a note. It has happened in many instances in our lifetimes here. Most of us, even those who are younger than me, we would have seen the change of banknotes. That is implemented solely by the central bank, and it will continue to be so. And I'll get to the legislation to have some discourse on some of the concerns Senior Counsel Choate raised. So the first marker is government took a decision, a policy decision based on national security concerns, and now that that decision has been taken, it moves to the legislation. Once the legislation is passed, the implementation and administration of the decision is up to the central bank. The interface with the public and the changing of the notes will be done by the banks, the commercial banks, the central bank in some instances, by the credit unions. So that's a good point to make. No one has raised it in this house, but it has been raised elsewhere. The credit unions will stand no differently. In fact, every single person with an existing $100 note, the paper currency, can go to the commercial banks, and if not the commercial banks, to the central bank and change their note. So there's no need for panic. It is a simple exercise. You have your existing currency. All you're being asked to do now is take that existing currency, what we will call the old $100 notes, and go and exchange it for the new $100 polymer notes. So let me say, again, for those who are just for the Hansard in the Senate, the reason that the government took this decision is because at national security, in the monitoring of criminal elements and crime taking place in our society, it was felt that this decision would fight money laundering, as Senator Timal discussed, including, Mr. Vice President, the financing of drugs, narcotics, and the illegal firearm trade. And I was happy to hear Senator Choate immediately come out and see, and I'm sure it's due to her experience and her understanding of what goes on with the criminal elements and the running of crime, organized crime, cash is king. So yes, with the importation of narcotics, you have to pay the people you're importing from in US currency. But cash is king in the domestic economy. In fact, the reference to one of the murders yesterday, unfortunately, the incident that took place in Chancellor, anyone who saw the photographs could not have failed to have noticed the strewn $100 bills in that unfortunate incident. That is but the latest example. Every time there's a drug bust or a bust of people who are engaged in criminal activity, the $100 note is the note of choice. Cash is king in the underground economy. The simple decision of changing the $100 banknote is going to hit at the heart of criminality and those who conduct their business in the criminal world. In fact, last night in the other place, I asked one of my colleagues who was asking similar questions. I said, do you know of a single drug dealer who is dealing in their enterprise here or even in human trafficking? We all know it. The human trafficking and the prostitution that is going on, the illegal firearm trade, they pay for it in cash. They don't take our links, they don't take our credit card, and they're not taking checks. Because the fact is, once you engage the banking system, there's a massive fingerprint that can be followed. So immediately, the overall scheme of national security is force the money into the system. And that is what a change and a demonetization does. It forces the cash into the system. We're dealing with the stored cash, the stored millions. Of course, money laundering comes in many forms. In fact, I can say here now that I've begun to get the reports that persons are rushing out to jewelry stores already and purchasing massive amounts of jewelry with cash. I can also, at this stage, Mr. Vice President, through you, give the assurance to the whole of Trinidad and Tobago to say With the grace of God, thank God, and with excellent planning and the implementation by our security forces, the money that has been brought in for the replacement of the existing notes is safe. To answer Senator Mark's question to the Minister of Finance, as the Minister of Finance told him, they're sufficient. Because one of the difficulties in other jurisdictions, in particular in India, that they faced was there was not sufficient new notes. There were not sufficient new notes to replace existing. I can say here without fear of contradiction, that will not happen in Trinidad and Tobago. We have studied this thing for months. It has been kept very secret, very confidential, driven by national security, and we have learned from the errors of other jurisdictions. Learned from the errors of India. In India, it was on the 8th of November 2016, the Prime Minister Modi stood up and declared on the 8th of November 2016, the same day, demonetization, taking your $500 bills and your $1,000 rupees, and you have to exchange it. And they started to fall into many problems. I'll say again at the outset, a very different jurisdiction. India in 2017, after that last census, had 1,339,000,000 people. 1,339,000,000 people. We have 1.3 million people. That is why we looked at the Mauritius model. Because Mauritius is similar to Trinidad and Tobago. Counterfeiting. I cannot give you the exact statistics of counterfeiting, because that in itself has implications. But I am certain that everyone saw the latest what was made public recently, where a counterfeiting ring was busted because of the work that we are doing. And what they did is they took $1 bills, the paper $1 bills, and they bleached them. So it's the same paper, money paper, and then they reprint it as $100 bills. By going to polymer, immediately eradicate that. So by just us taking a decision to upgrade a $100 note to polymer, that's your first security feature. And there are a number of other security features that the central bank, immediately after the government's announcement, began to educate the public. I think it was Senator Obika made the point that there needs to be a public relations exercise and educate the public as to what is going on, what the time frames are, how it will be dealt with. All of those things are considered and will be done by the central bank. And they don't require the government's assistance with funding. And I can give you all the assurance, all of that material arrived as well. The central bank will administer and implement this decision, and they are very prepared. We have consulted with the world experts in this area, including the legal experts, and that is why we've come with the Section 27E. When you look at section, if I can go very briefly to the existing Central Bank Act, Mr. Vice President, I'll start with Section 21 under Part 2, Currency and Legal Tender. Section 21 of the Central Bank Act says, the currency of Trinidad and Tobago are the notes and coins issued by the bank under this act. That's the central bank. It's not the government. Of course, it must be done on consultation with the government and these types of things. The bank, subsection 2, has a sole right to issue notes and coins. We are not interfering with that in Trinidad and Tobago, and such notes and coins are legal tender. Go very quickly to Section 27(1). Section 27(1) says, the bank, with the approval of the minister, now Senate Senior Counsel Choate made a point about the difference in language about with the approval of the minister compared to the minister may direct. But Section 27(1) says, the bank, with the approval of the minister, may, on giving 3 months' notice, publish in the Gazette, call in any of its notes and coins on the payment of the face value. That is the demonetization clause as existing. When we looked at it from a legal point of view, proportionality, for it to be in compliance with the law, to protect everybody's rights, that is why we're introducing a 27E, and I'll get into that, and all of the differentiating features of the proposed 27E compared to 27(1), and why we went the route of 27E. Back to the national security reasons and why we're doing this. We're striking at the heart of the financing of drugs, narcotics, illegal firearms, tax evasion, the black money economy, corruption, counterfeiting, and other related problems. Can I get into the specifics? Can I tell you exactly who it is without breaching what we're trying to achieve at national security? No. But there will not be a single Trinidad and Tobagonian law-abiding citizen that is not aware that cash is fueling crime and the storing of cash, because they know the criminal elements, from the white-collar criminals to the drug dealers and the gun dealers and those engaged in petty crime, they store cash, because the moment they take it and put it into the system, there's a trail. And one of the reasons you go for demonetization and of the note that is most used by the criminal element, which in our instance is the $100 note, because it carries the most value and you have to carry less hundreds to make up your amount than 20s, 5s, 10s, and 1s, is immediately when you demonetize, you push the change of money into the system. Senator Obika is right. He called them smurfs. That is a concept we're aware of. The legislation already covers for these types of things. That's the FIU Act. And the obligation of the banks, the commercial banks, with KYC and AML procedures, know your customer, anti-money laundering procedures that already exist, the POCA Act and these types of things. Demonetization is a policy decision and a drive that, amongst other things, pushes the money into the system. We spoke about, Senator Hussain raised the issue of our Muslim brothers and sisters in society and what some of them are asking about. There is no compulsion for anyone to open a bank account. You do not have to go and open a bank account to get your new notes. You walk into the bank, you present your old notes, you get your new notes. So at the outset, there is absolutely no mandatory obligation on anyone, if you don't have a bank account, to open a bank account. If the banks don't want to take it, we are making provisions in discussions with the central bank. We're not making, but in discussions with the central bank as to how it should be administered, the central bank stands available to deal with it. Because you're right. Persons in certain cultures and religions will save their money, especially some of the older people, and they don't want to go to the bank. But what they will now do, and the central bank at the appropriate time will list it out for us. This is what you do, this is where you go, this is how you, it's a simple exchange of note for note. So you don't lose any value, and we're certainly not forcing anybody to go into the system. So let no hearts be worried about that. Let's look very briefly at the specific legislation before I answer some of the other questions. I'll also say at the outset that we can't say at this stage the appointed date, the timing, that is for the central bank to do. The central bank can't announce it because the legislation hasn't been passed. So the central bank couldn't come out and say X days. It is not 14 days. It will not be 14 days. We recognize the timing issue. But as I've said in other places, the timing will never satisfy everybody. Now is Christmas. After Christmas is Carnival. After Carnival is Easter. After Easter is summer. You're back into Christmas. So what comes down to it is the reasonableness of the time period. And what we're doing is we're seeking to change, moving it from 3 months to a minimum of 14 days. And it will be more than the 14 days. Why now? Why you can't put it off? Because it's been announced. If you're going to tackle corruption and fight crime, I can't come on Thursday and say, listen, next year, March, I demonetize it. I'll be a fool. You would have given the criminal element all of that time in the world. Every single thing has been thought out very carefully, including the operation that went down during the wee hours of this morning that unfortunately had to inconvenience people, and I apologize for that. But when you're moving that type of cargo, you have to ensure the safety and security, not only of the cargo, but of those charged with the responsibility of delivering it safely. Let's look quickly at Section 27A as proposed. The new Section 27A that we're proposing starts off at 1. In addition to the powers of the bank under Section 27, I've read Section 27 already, the minister may direct the bank to cancel any note issued to it, by it, giving not less than 14 days' notice, published in the Gazette. And considering the legal advice, they said there must be certainty. Give the bank the express power to demonetize. Don't get into an argument using, so for example, you could look at 27.1 as it currently exists, say, well, why we don't just change the 3-month period to a minimum of 14? So the first thing is no. Let's give it an express provision to deal with demonetization issues like this, where it's going to be in a short period of time. Because to be effective in the fight of crime and in anti-corruption when you're demonetizing, can't be long. India tried to force it overnight. They had to extend. But even with 1.339 billion people, the maximum period for them was 5 months. They ran into a number of difficulties. Their economy is very different to us, very cash-oriented, cash-driven. But don't underestimate how much 1.339 billion is compared to 1.3 million. That's why we use the example of Mauritius. I've explained the counterfeiting part. You go to Section 27A2, subsection 2. On the appointed date, the specified notes shall cease to be the currency of or be legal tender in Trinidad and Tobago, and subject to subsection 4, shall for the purposes be cancelled. You achieve two things here in law. You've expressly stated that the notes will no longer be of legal tender. So there is no room or need for clarity. There's no room for people not to understand. But importantly, what you've said now is subject to subsection 4. 3 is that the bank, we're telling people, and most importantly, telling the central bank to protect the property rights of people, that the bank shall redeem at face value any specified notes which are presented for redemption prior. That makes it mandatory for the central bank on presentation of a $100 note, paper currency existing. For a new note, they have to give you the value of 100. So you're not losing anything in between there. Subsection 4, the bank shall redeem at face value any of the specified notes that are presented within the period of 3 months after the appointed date, remembering that the appointed date is the demonetized date. That's the date where the old currency no longer has legal value. But now you're providing here in subsection 4 for the eventualities that you may not be able to predict, for the people who may be sick, the people who may not be able to be there. We're realistic. We know that there are people who travel to Trinidad on an annual basis, come for carnival, come for summer, come for Christmas, whatever, and they're not here. So we're not pushing them out of the system. This section 4 immediately gives a 3-month period, and it says, if you're satisfied that the failure to present the notes for redemption prior to the appointed date resulted from circumstances beyond the control of the true owner of the notes, of course you all will understand, especially those who practice the law, why we say the true owner, to deal with the Smurfs situation, of the notes, or that there was some other good or sufficient reason. We can't predict all of the reasons. So this catches it. We start off with 3 months. When you go further to the next subsection 5, the minister, meaning the Minister of Finance, may by order extend the date of period in either 1 or 4. So we've proportionality, we have covered express provision, we've also covered if something occurs, you're not caught, which is what 27.1 now does. So this is where the additional protection comes in. And I want to say at the outset, there's absolutely no intention whatsoever. You know Trinidadians, you tell them do something in 10 days, nobody moves for the first 9 days, and on the 10th day, everybody there. We have gone through it time and time again. One of the most recent ones that comes to mind is when we said we're going to, with licensing of vehicles. You extend them for 3 more months, so you take another 3 months. Unfortunately, Minister Sinanan isn't here to tell me when he was shouting at me, I need more police here and there. Trinidadians, citizens, when you get the date, do what needs to be done. We have met with the banks. The Minister in Finance and myself have met with the banks, the Governor has met with the banks, and we have sensitized them to a lot of what you all raised.
Thank you. Madam President, I want to thank the Mr. Vice President. Sorry. I want to thank the Minister for giving way. One very critical issue I would like you to address before you wrap up is the issue of perhaps additional security for the public in moving the bills. Yes.
Minister of National Security wouldn't come here and not address the issue of security. So thank you. Right? So we've provided additional safeguards here for everyone. Then we talk about 6, what that is, and that the bank will issue procedures. Because again, to make it clear to people, this is what is going to be applicable during this time period. 7, 8 is the definitions. Let me jump quickly to the amendments to poker. Not much time needs to be spent on this. By passing this legislation as well, we're fulfilling obligations that we have to FATF and Global Forum. Those 2 whips that are constantly over our head as a jurisdiction. So we're satisfying them on stuff as well. I heard the murmuring of financing of terrorism. You all understand that as well. That in a nutshell is what we're dealing with legislatively. Let me just touch on some of the issues that have been raised here and outside. As I said, timing. It would never be convenient. In order to achieve success in dealing with corruption, money laundering, we have to move decisively and we have to move quickly, and that's what we're doing. Inconvenience. Absolutely, there'll be inconvenience. Our job in helping the banks and the central bank is to try and minimize the inconvenience. There will always be some measure of inconvenience when the state implements measures and operations to tackle crime. There'll always be inconvenience. What you saw this morning with the traffic was unfortunate, but it had to be done. Because God forbid something happened with the movement of the cargo. Businessmen, some businessmen, and when you look at all of some other jurisdictions, but even businessmen in Trinidad have said that they think this will actually stimulate the economy at this time. And it's already happening. Because people who have their cash now have to take decisions. It brings me to a good point that I think Senator Timal touched on and maybe someone else. Money laundering in property and jewelry and these types of things. The FIU legislation captures it. All right? I find it a most ridiculous proposition that any law-abiding citizen would go to buy a $4 million property or $1 million property in cash. I can't fathom that, but maybe I am from Mars. But there is no law-abiding citizen I'd like to put on record. There is no law-abiding citizen that I put on record that would object to the principles that demonetization have to capture. And I haven't heard a single person in here today object to the principles behind it, nor in the other place last night. Law-abiding people have nothing to be worried about. The people who have illicit cash, who have it stored and now are looking for other ways to money launder, are caught by the existing legislation. The authorities are aware of it, meaning the FIU and the banks. The same internal tick boxes, the same internal due diligence that Senator Obika spoke about. Benefits. When you look at some of the benefits in other jurisdictions, including India, that had one of the most tumultuous changeovers of money that can be. 1, an effective way to curb black money economy, corruption, and counterfeiting. 2, all law-abiding citizens who are not involved in malpractice will welcome this as a good move, and they've already started. It forces unaccounted cash into an accountable system. It could also assist in citizens opening bank accounts and depositing their money, which opens the safety. It's not compulsory, but you now have a decision to take. If you've been dealing in cash and you have cash stored, you have to change the cash, take a decision. And it may be that the bank will say, okay, well, you walk in here with X amount, the same sort of thresholds that one of the senators referred to, you will walk out with X amount in cash, the rest we'll give you a check for your own safety. Banks, of course, see this as an encouraging step towards a cashless society. They have come out, the Bankers Association have come out and said they see this as a good move. For every law-abiding citizen, I'd like to say, it's worth repeating, For every law-abiding citizen, Mr. Vice President, this is a simple exchange of bring in your old notes and get your new notes. To the questions that have been raised and to Senator Amin, obviously, our security services are going to play a role in this. I can say that in the middle of the sitting yesterday, during the night, I called a meeting with the heads of security of all of the commercial banks, as well as our security services. Started off yesterday morning at 7:30 with all of our security services. We are going to provide the maximum level of security cover that can be provided. We're even looking at the intelligence as to where it goes. But people still have to utilize common sense. One of the things I told the banks, you have an obligation to your customers to provide security. So understand you must increase your own personal security levels during the period leading towards demonetization. The security services will provide cover. The Defense Force played a very important and essential role today and will continue to do so. I will say no more on that because for obvious reasons, we will not say what we're going to do, but I give the assurance we will be working. And we recognize the difficult period in terms of timing and it's Christmas, how busy people will be. Just be sensible. We will work with the commercial banks, with the credit unions, whoever we need to, including the utilization of technology. Worth repeating, this is to be implemented and administered by the central bank. We are not interfering with that. That's not our area of expertise. That's for the central bank. We took the policy decision, and implementation of that policy decision now is up to the central bank. The central bank stated on Thursday, and it's worth repeating, co-circulation, which means the two bills, when they announce, when the central bank announces when the new bill will be put into circulation very soon, the two bills will co-circulate and be legal tender for a period of time until the appointed date that the central bank will give us notice of when the appointed date is, and at that time, money will stop, the old bills will stop being legal tender, subject to the exceptions that the legislation provides for. Let me see if I could just touch very briefly on some of the issues I've heard raised here that I may not have dealt with. Every time we come here, one of the submissions made is the government going with legislation and they think they could solve. The government does not believe for a moment you solve crime only with legislation. The government has been working. We are here, as I've said repeatedly, it's become tedious now. Our job as legislators is to pass legislation. So you look, you listen, what is the type of legislation that can assist in the fight of crime? We say this is one. Is this being done in isolation? Absolutely not. There are other things being implemented. I'd also like to say that the government has provided and is providing resources to the security services. And most importantly, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, our intelligence services, and the Defense Force. In our limited resources that we have, which is the taxpayers' money, we have been providing the resources to them. I'd like to put on record here, the Attorney General asked me to put it on record. There was some suggestion that no one has been charged for money laundering. Not true. There have been a number of charges, especially over the last 2 years, on money laundering. Money laundering doesn't happen alone. Money laundering is part of organized crime. The human trafficking cases that we're going on with right now, and the sub judice, I don't want to say too much, there are money laundering elements of that. So the charges, in addition to human trafficking, would be money laundering. Illegal firearms, illegal drugs, these types of things, depending on the money that you find on them. We've dealt with the issue raised by Senator Hussain, which is for Muslim brothers and sisters. Simple. I'll repeat it again. Just take your cash in, your old bills in, exchange it for your new bills. No one is being forced to open a bank account. No one is being forced to engage the banks, deposit your money, and then get into that whole element that may be objectionable on the grounds of religious suasion. This is, Senator Timal, I think, had referred to it. the unexplained wealth legislation that was recently passed by this House. This is just another element to that. We have gone for explain your wealth orders. We've succeeded recently in getting explain your wealth orders of criminal persons. So the person who on the face of it is a fruit vendor or fisherman, but walking into Range Rover and buying a Range Rover cash, and then having more gold than we could dream of, and living in a mansion that we can't even dream of building, but the boat there coming in with fish. This is another element of tackling that, the demonetization. With the Explain Your Wealth orders, the Poker Act, all of the other pieces of legislation begin to fall in place. But it is up for law enforcement and the Director of Public Prosecutions to now administer and implement. As I said before, we're saying a minimum of 14 days. We're not saying it will be 14 days. People of Trinidad and Tobago, when the central bank makes the announcement as to what is the appointed day and the date that demonetization will take place by, make sure during that period to go and change your money. Do not count on there being any extension. That is the whole purpose of demonetization. There will be thresholds, there will be heightened security, and the central bank already has its planned PR campaign where they will be educating the public. And I agree with some of the comments made before. Yesterday in a meeting with Minister of Finance and myself and the heads of the banks, we told them they have to understand the customers. They have to understand the people walking in. They're the front line. They have to have the empathy. They have to be the ones to ensure that people are comfortable in the implementation and administering of this policy. Just to make sure that we've covered the legal aspects, we've provided the express authority to permit this interference, to expressly state how you're changing the money. We've also provided expressly now for the central bank to set a date beyond which it will no longer redeem the demonetized money. These are some of the issues they had in other jurisdictions.
Very much, Minister. Just on a legal point, if you can clarify, now that we have two systems of demonetization, you will have the Section 27 and now the 27A. Is it that the government, if we have to demonetize in the future, what will government decide which format they use?
Section 27A is the clear one for demonetization. Understand it is arguable that what Section 27(1) in its existing form could be is when you say, as happens now, with the $50 bills, you have two different types of $50 bills in circulation and those types of things. This one is for clear demonetization in these circumstances. This is the period, this is what happens, etc. So I don't think it's parallel systems or confusing systems. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. So just to press on, we've also provided for the mechanics of exchange and the time limit set to take into account the needs of the holders of old notes, including those who are unable through disability, illness, or otherwise to exchange their notes in a manner beyond the time prescribed, for those who are not present in the jurisdiction, for those who may live in remote areas and have particular difficulty accessing banks, those who don't have a bank account. Those are some of the issues that we had to think about, and that is why we came with the Section 27A to expressly provide for that, to protect the rights of persons in different circumstances. Mr. Vice President, I'd like to take the opportunity in concluding to thank...
Mr. Vice President, forgive my bugbear with, I just want to suggest a grammatical, is that all right? You know my predilection. I'm looking at 55(3)(c). The amendment you made, you took out is and as. Having taken out is and as, I would like to suggest the last transaction means a transaction, comma, the value of which the minister, comma, may by order prescribe. May by order, comma, prescribe.
Much.
So because it isn't as goes in the out in the amendment, so I'm
Right.
putting commas in, and so we could in that space there.
Thank you very much. I've listened. We'll consider it. We'll consult with the drafts people. As I was saying, I'd like to conclude by assuring the public of Trinidad and Tobago this policy was not one taken lightly. The sole purpose of this policy is to fight corruption. It is being driven by national security with the assistance, obviously, of the Ministry of Finance. Central Bank is the implementing agency. And I'm happy to hear that from the leader of the opposition, Godong, it is supported. And I would have been surprised if it wasn't, because every law-abiding citizen would immediately understand and appreciate what is the objective, how we're trying to achieve it. We will provide as much security as we can. People, please be responsible. Please utilize your common sense, and we will work with people towards the ensuring of this transaction and as we move from the old note to the new note. I thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I rise to address a few areas of the legislation and to seek clarification from the Minister of Finance on areas that the public has expressed some concern over. But before doing so, Mr. Vice President, I just want to indicate that this bill, which is amending the Central Bank Act and the Proceeds of Crime Act, deals, as the Minister of National Security has said, essentially with the government's drive to fight corruption, money laundering, narcotics, illegal firearms, among other areas in their anti-crime policy on our thrust. Mr. Vice President, when I looked at the Express of Friday, the 6th of December, most, and I'm talking about page 4, most of the commentary on this page dealt with the important role played by the Minister of National Security in piloting and advancing and ultimately receiving the support of the Cabinet for the measure that we are dealing with here today. We have been advised by the Honorable Minister that this matter has been well planned and properly thought out. Yet when we go to the next page, which is page 5 of this newspaper, you have a number of business organizations appealing to the government for more time in order to facilitate this change, this massive change. Mr. Vice President, I don't know if you recall, but I am trying to. Since independence, I cannot recall, but I stand to be corrected by the Minister of Finance, whether we have ever cancelled.
Honorable Senator, the time is now 4:20, and we will take the tea break until 5 p.m. This House now stands suspended until 5 p.m.